Good morning. My name's Jim Stage. I'm going to talk about a wonderful topic, sex and embryo transfer. Interestingly enough, when I went to look to research this topic, I can only find two or three papers specifically talking about intercourse. A little bit about seminal plasma, which I'll talk about later on. But there may be more, but these are the only two that have specifically looked at the impact of sexual intercourse on pregnancy rates. And I'll describe both of those in a minute. But I just like to make the point that there's over 2,500 articles published every year on IVF. Look at the number. These are all the publications. These are the open access ones, which is good because they're the ones that I can review. And these are the reviews, which are slowly creeping up. And so look at IVF's been going for a long time, but even things like PGT-A has only just started in the last 10 years. And here is the number of articles about intercourse and IVF, zero, well, two. I'd also just like to point out that I have created a notice board where if you're a company or a clinic involved in IVF and you'd like to promote your business in some way, this is a place where you can just put a link to your website. So contact me if you wish for a very nominal fee. Okay, so the question is, should clinics advise couples against having intercourse during IVF? It's one of the most common questions nurses are asked during treatment. You really get questions from doctors, and scientists almost never get the question. But back in the early 1990s, we had a nurse working for us who had come out of family planning, and she was quite happy to talk about all aspects of intercourse. And most couples indicated to her that quite a few had intercourse very early in the cycle, just after they finished their period, and quite a few had intercourse in the week prior to when they um, were falling pregnant, but they all wanted to know what the advice of the clinic was. And so we did a study, and this nurse asked all the people coming through, about 200 or so, gave them a chart and asked them what days they had intercourse relative to their transfer. And I remember her coming to us with all the data and showing me that about 40–50% of couples, even though they were told not to have intercourse, did have intercourse. Some usually they waited 1 to 2 days after transfer, but after that, the number increased quite a lot. And so the question really was asked, does that make any difference? And of course, when we looked at the pregnancy rates, there were no difference at all. So when she gave a talk, she said, if couples say, can you have intercourse? You can say, well, here's the data we looked at, and it had no impact. So I thought I would just go back and look at the two papers that were published on this because it's a bit confusing. One, we're talking about intercourse, but there's a lot of other people talking about seminal plasma, and that's been around for a long time. A few papers here or there have all suggested exposure to seminal plasma somewhere down the track is good for pregnancy. And I think I'll do another talk later on about how the immune system is used to get rid of surplus sperm. However, there are only two looking at pregnancy rates. So the first one was published in 2000. That's 26 years ago, right? I think this is a topic which people have steered clear of, but in fact, I think we need to come back and look at that in a more structural way because this was a study where the multi-center prospective randomized controlled trial was conducted. I have to say this is not open access, which I get really cross with. I believe that journals like Human Reproduction should make these journals articles which are more than, say, 10 or 20 years old, free access to so people can go back and look at the historical data. So all I can go is the abstract, and that's all you can do if you look at the video. But this study was a multi-center prospective randomized controlled trial that was conducted to determine if intercourse during the peri-transfer period of IVF has any influence on pregnancy success. Participants undergoing thawed embryo transfer in an Australian centre and fresh embryo transfers were randomised to either abstain or to engage in vaginal intercourse around the time of embryo transfer. And I guess it's often better to do it before transfer than after transfer. But in reality, you know what? I don't think it makes any difference. It looks at what they say. They found the transfer of 1,300 odd embryos during 478 cycles of IVF resulted in 107 pregnancies, so 22%, with 125 viable embryos remaining viable after 6 to 8 weeks. So they found there was no significant difference between intercourse and the abstained groups in relation to the pregnancy rate, 23 to 21%, but the proportion of transferred embryos that were viable 6 to 8 weeks after transfer was significantly higher in women exposed to semen compared to those who abstained, 11% to 7% of all viable embryos. Interesting, I published a paper a long, long time ago looking at the number of embryos you produce against the number of pregnancies, and I came back with a figure of 11% of all embryos will give rise to pregnancy. So 11% of all viable embryos transferred were still intact, but there was more in the intercourse group than the stain group. So there's a little bit there to do with the implantation, just promoting implantation a bit, but because it's not open access, I got no idea what they meant. But they concluded that exposure to semen around about the time of embryo transfer increases the likelihood of successful early implantation and development. Okay, the second one was actually more interesting, and I had to read it a second time before I really understood it. But this was a thing from some Chinese authors, I believe, looking at the impact of sexual intercourse on FETs, a randomized controlled trial, exposure of female reproductive tract to either seminal plasma or fluid component of the ejaculate is thought to be beneficial in achieving successful implantation and normal embryo development. But whether the physical component of sexual intercourse during the peri-transfer period has any influence on FET pregnancy rates is not clear. And my sort of point out is that this is an interesting debate, but if you go back and look at the pregnancy rates for same-sex couples, so same-sex female couples, lesbian couples, the pregnancy rates there are the same as everyone else. So almost proof that seminal plasma exposure is not necessarily a requirement for successful pregnancy at all. But that's another issue. In fact, that should be another really good issue just for my video collection. But in this study, they conducted a randomized trial that included 223 patients undergoing IVF at a university-affiliated reproductive centre between 2018 and 2019, so it's a while ago. This paper was published in 23, so they took 5 years to write the paper. Enrolled patients undergoing IVF treatment were randomized to either engage in sexual intercourse using a barrier contraception, which was a condom, or to abstain. And we have to assume they did abstain. Well, people never always tell you the truth, of course. The night before embryo transfer. And I just might like to make a point. When we did this study with a nurse a while ago, hardly any, there were no intercourse activity the day of or day after embryo egg collection. And the reason for that was significant pain and discomfort, and the pain and discomfort lasted quite a long time. So the reason people weren't having intercourse to a large extent was given down to discomfort. And we often think that after vaginal ultrasound pickup that it's okay the next day, but in reality, the women were recording significant discomfort sufficient to inhibit them from having intercourse for up to a week afterwards. And I think that's something that we need to visit as well. And what they found, getting back to this topic, I'm rambling a bit, patients having intercourse had a higher clinical pregnancy rate, 51% compared to 37, and a higher implantation rate compared to those who did not engage intercourse. However, there's no significant difference in spontaneous miscarriage rate between the two. So this is the exact opposite of the previous one, where in fact they showed that there was no difference if you had intercourse, but the ones that had exposure to plasma had fewer miscarriages. This one here, wanted to look at the pregnancy rate. So these are people who are just having protected intercourse. So there's no seminal plasma. It's just the active intercourse, and I'm not going to get involved in the nature of it. I think, well, that's all my expertise. However, the interesting thing is the pregnancy rate of P of 0.4045 is only means that's another couple of cases here and there. You could lose that significance, but an implantation rate, 37% compared to 24%. This is what I know. The study was done 5, 6, 7 years ago. 0.005 is actually quite strong. You will need quite a few cases to overturn that. So in other words, just the act of having intercourse the day before seemed to make a difference. And I think actually this study has been sort of largely ignored, but someone who's looking at this video may like to go back and see whether in fact this is true, because that doesn't quite make sense, except that it's something to do with intercourse and implantation occurring is to do with the the arousal or blood flow, etc., rather than seminal plasma. I think that's something that we need to be aware of. And quite frankly, I'm going to stay right out of it, but I thought I'd just mention it. So sexual intercourse before embryo transfer may improve clinical pregnancy and implantation rates. How it should be noted that patients chose only one time for sexual intercourse, that is the night before embryo transfer, and so I think that needs to be studied a bit further. But there's a couple of other ones looking, these go back a while. This is 2014, looking at the factors of seminal plasma. There's two ones I'm going to do. One was a review of 2,200 patients, including 7 randomized trial. And they also had that significantly improved clinical pregnancy rate by intention to treat with exposure to seminal plasma. So there was a significant improvement in clinical pregnancy rate, but there was no statistical significant improvements in the outcome of ongoing or live birth rates. So that's in contrary to the previous data. And so I think that basically the jury's out. But there was a paper published last year, or late 2024, where couples, actually we've done this as well back in the late 80s. It's probably been known by lots of people and just ignored but they did a double-blind randomized control trial, and they showed that it prepared simultaneously applied to the vagina directly after OPU did not increase the rates of live birth or clinical pregnancy rate. The importance of immunological factors to allow the implantation of an embryo is not questioned, or maybe should be, but no improvement in live birth rates in IVF by introducing male partners prepared seminal plasma after egg collection has been found. So just as I'd like to finish up, just a cautionary tale. So we had a case quite a long time ago where a woman had twins after a single embryo transfer. The woman sued the clinic, arguing that the clinic had transferred the wrong embryos, but the woman was shown all the case records clearly showing the correct embryo had been transferred with duplicate signatures at all critical steps. The doctor confirms she asked whether sex had taken place, and there was no sex before transfer. So the doctor then asked for a DNA test of the children to ascertain if, in fact, the wrong embryo had been transferred, because we couldn't understand how that could have occurred. There's nothing in our documentation to suggest in any way that an error had been made. But when presented with this, the woman cancelled the lawsuit. So clearly she had something else had happened. The point is that there is a reason why clinics ask couples not to have sex before IVF when natural ovulation is occurring, because of the risk of additional pregnancies. Now, for some couples, this will be great. If they had twins or triplets, they'd love it, but many not so. We also had a case of a same-sex couple that came through having timed insemination, AIH, and they had twins when they only wanted one. And even though there's only one follicle of 80 millimeters when we induced ovulation, there were a couple of 14s or so. And clearly two pregnancies arrived from both of those. So in that case, the couple did not have twins. They did not want twins. And they successfully sued the clinic for having two pregnancies rather than one. So there's no doubt, there's no data. Just to summarize, there's no data to suggest that sex around about the time of embryo transfer has any negative bearing on the chance of pregnancy. And indeed, about 40% of couples had, in our own private experience back in the clinic, this is the 1990s, did have sex in the days after transfer, largely waiting for pain to disappear, but certainly around about the time of implantation to pregnancy test, about half the couples were actually having intercourse. The suggestion of the impact on exposure to seminal plasma also has little traction. I think there's work to be done there again, but I think that the experiments haven't been done the right way. The suggestion that protective intercourse before transfer may be beneficial remains unconfirmed, but this may be a good compromise that clinics could recommend. So if people say, can we have intercourse or not, then you might like to say, well, we suggest you can have it because it makes no difference, but wear a condom just because there's a chance of multiple pregnancy. And if there's been a lot of follicles around, there are a lot of eggs that are not collected but pick up, that are floating around the system. But suggestions, in fact, we know that from our gift and prost days back in the late 80s when we used to gift where we put eggs and sperm back in the tube at pick up, and then we do prost, which we putting back per-nuclear stage transfers, but there was still more than one pregnancy in those days. but the suggestion the immune system is activated by the presence of spermatozoa on the tract cannot be discounted. In fact, I'm going to do a whole talk on that a bit later on, where sperm are actually removed, non-capacitated or prematurely capacitated sperm removed by the immune system must have some impact on telling the system that sperm are available. And lastly, there have been many studies suggesting that abstaining from intercourse that build up the sperm reservoir to get a really good sperm count has little traction, because we've all shown that only abstaining for even half a day gave you often a better sperm count, just fewer sperm. Okay, that's enough on this topic. I think actually that I need to keep an eye on this, because I think we need to come back to this. But I'd like to say my name's James Danger. I'm an embryologist with 50 years experience. I'm not a medical person. This information is not medical advice, but it may help you know what questions to ask about your treatment with your doctor, and maybe to help in understanding the advice you receive. From this video, you can say, "Doctor, can we have intercourse during the treatment cycle?" And he'll say, "By absolutely, whatever you like, but wear a condom." So if you like what I'm talking about, press subscribe, leave a comment. But whatever you do, tell your fellow clinic members or support group about my website, and I hope it helps. But I'd just like to make a point that this is funded by my own fertday.com website, which is an online EQA training program in andrology and embryology. I'd like to thank you for your time. I know IVF is a personal journey that involves the action of many concepts, technology, staff, etc., and it helps to understand as many aspects as you can. At this point in time, I'd like to say thank you for your attention and goodbye.